Roughly 2 years ago, ChatGPT was released to the public, and so many people began to use it for all kinds of different purposes. Maybe you've used ChatGPT to help you with some assignments and different things like that. Probably not essays, because I think you know that, well, there are plagiarism checkers and all kinds of ways to check if ChatGPT was used to write something. As Christians, we might be tempted to use ChatGPT. Maybe you're already using ChatGPT to help you with some kind of Bible questions or searching for scriptures. And so I want to talk about today some ways that you definitely don't want to use ChatGPT, or things to keep in mind, and possibly one use case that could be helpful. Okay, and so for today's video, I wanted to use ChatGPT in a way that maybe you might want to use ChatGPT to ask it questions where you want to find certain answers. And so the first question I asked ChatGPT was, were the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses? And here you can see the results up on the screen right here. I don't know if you're able to read all this. It's probably too small to read everything unless you maybe zoom in on your phone, unless you're sitting at your computer. But what you can see here is that overall ChatGPT gave a pretty good answer, at least in presenting the information. Now, as you can see, it gives us a little bit of information here about the religious tradition. And the problem with this little section is that it almost seems to put religious tradition as, well, here's the kind of traditional thought, but maybe under that, as you're going to see, this is perhaps the more scholarly, more academic way of looking at the question. And the reason why I say that's a problem is we're not robots. While ChatGPT is AI, or I mean, that might be debatable, but ChatGPT is some kind of intelligence, or it's a large language learning model, or whatever they call that. ChatGPT does a very specific thing where it scours the web for these topics, and it compiles everything in a way that is hopefully a good representation of the information that's out there and the consensus on something. But again, because we're not robots and we're not an AI, we look at things a little bit differently. And so when we look at something like this, you can see religious tradition, a couple sentences almost seems like not that relevant. And then this whole other section about modern scholarly perspective. The average person's going to look at this and think, okay, well, this is like the real thing then, and this is just kind of tradition. And that's a problem, because that's not always going to be the case. Some cases, yes, maybe the modern perspective is better and it's more correct and accurate, but that's not always the case. Sometimes just in modern history, we come up with brand new ideas. We want to look at things in a different way. And so that's what is driving our perspective, rather than actually it being the truth. It's just this heart to look at something a different way. And so it presents this whole thing. We can get into this. I don't know if I'll ever get into this, actually. I don't think you want to get into this, but there's this whole authorship theory that's called the documentary hypothesis. And essentially there's 4 or 5 different categories of authors. It's not even people. Some of them are specific people, some are like groups of people. So it could be like dozens of people contributed to writing the first 5 books of the Bible. My personal thought is, well, no, Moses is definitely the author, but then there are definitely cases where some scribes later on came to put just a couple of details that do not change the meaning of the scripture in any way. It's just to give a little bit of insight, like, and then this is where Moses died. Like, obviously Moses wouldn't write that about himself. A scribe had to later come in and put that detail. How about on a question like, does the Bible condemn homosexuality? How would ChatGPT answer a question like that? Overall, it presented, I'm not going to show you the full answer up on the screen, but overall it presented, I would think, all the important pieces, at least in a condensed way, because there's so much that we need to talk about, and we need to explain these things very thoroughly, right? Did a decent job at presenting the different scriptures, the relevant scriptures on this topic, as we're going to see here on the screen, the Old Testament and the New Testament. But where ChatGPT fails, because it's not a Bible scholar, it is simply, again, it just scours the internet for the information, it tries to find consensus. But where it fails is because it's not a Bible scholar, it's not able to make those connections itself. So even though something's from the Old Testament, we have a way of knowing when we need to appeal, like when we need to care about the thing that was back in the Old Testament, if it's a law. And the simple rule is that if it shows back up in the New Testament, that's just the simple rule. So if Paul, let's say for example, confirms that that Old Testament law is still valid today, then that Old Testament law is not simply some cultural thing for that time. It now becomes a timeless thing for all of God's people forever. And that's what I would say for these verses that come from Leviticus on this issue of the act of homosexuality being condemned. And also even the reference from Romans 1 here that ChatGPT talks about briefly, it doesn't give the full context actually. It doesn't show us, there's even more important parts to this whole passage in Romans 1 that we need to consider and bring into the whole conversation. And then finally from 1 Corinthians 6, it talks about this word arsenokoitos or arsenokoitai. That's really, really important to this discussion. And it seems to kind of paint it in a light that, well, there's like a debate on this, and that's actually not the case. Like the main scholars, the people who are the most well-respected, who are the most accomplished in this field, are not confused on the meaning of this word. It's only the very modern, kind of fringe scholars who are confused, or they like to bring confusion and try to say, oh, there's maybe some other alternative meanings. And that's just simply not the case. I'm a little bit worried that you, as the average young Christian out there, you wouldn't be able to discern, is this a good answer or not, and why is it a good answer? I do think if you're going to use ChatGPT to do this, which I don't recommend, and I'll get to that in just a second, is you should ask a lot of follow-up questions to ChatGPT to make sure you're understanding what it's actually saying. Here's one use where I would say if you want to use ChatGPT in this way, it's probably not as it's probably more harmful than just Googling the same thing. And it's to ask ChatGPT for some Bible passages on a certain topic that you want to look up. Okay, and so for example here, I looked up all the different Bible passages, or 10 different Bible passages on the topic of depression and sorrow. And ChatGPT, I looked through all the references and they seem to be quite good. Though we should take the time to understand the context for these, especially when it's the Old Testament. We can't always just take something at face value and think that, oh, of course, that's just for me. We have to understand that God wrote this, or God's message to his people were at a very specific time for a specific purpose with those specific people in mind, okay? And so a good thing to do, as you can see here on the screen, is when you see a passage, especially from the Old Testament and from the New Testament as well, but especially the Old Testament, is to ask for the context, and that will help you to understand what God was saying to those people through that verse. And then later you can see how you might apply that to your life. And so if you couldn't guess already, my opinion on using ChatGPT is I would really want to not recommend it to you. It's not reliable, and you can see on the screen here, if you ask Google, is ChatGPT reliable? I think you know the answer. The answer is actually no, it's not reliable, because it is simply, again, pulling all these different things and it's trying to compile, but it doesn't always get it right. It can actually get some things that are factually, like, very easy to know that it's incorrect. It gets them wrong on that, or it has the wrong answer. And so if that's happening, I don't think you should be trusting ChatGPT with matters of you understanding the Bible and theology and doctrine. But maybe in a case like where you want to look at Bible verses for something, and where you're willing to do a little bit more study to make sure you understand the context, then it could be a helpful tool potentially. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. If it was, leave a like, leave a comment down below, subscribe if you're not a subscriber already. But that's it for today, guys. God bless you, love you, peace.